there is the possibility where taking power, having authority is something we shouldn't really be afraid of on the left. Why does no one just start a, let's just call it left party in America, right? Why do we have to trade our best players to the Democrats and then they ended up getting subsumed into that morass, right? Like we could just
Yeah.
start our own thing, right? And yeah, like you have, again, just in my exact example, like you have great reason to be suspicious of sort of elite capture and institutional corruption and the way in which it sort of just reproduces the conditions that it needs and it doesn't really move forward, right? So yeah, I mean there does need to be a serious break and there does need to be a serious reconstitution of what we think of institutions and also how they act for this to happen. So that's largely how I think. And I think most people on the left would see what I'm saying, right? Like they'll be receptive to that vision, I believe, but that they have to kind of take this picture in their mind that they have of the past and kind of erase it essentially.
All right. I am joined today by Mike Pepi. Mike, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Me too. We are gathered today to talk about Against Platforms, your excellent new polemic. Can't recommend this enough. It seems like the right place to start is a quote that you write in the introduction, where you say, "This is a book about an ideology run amok." So, what is that ideology run amok?
Yeah, I mean that's really the book in a nutshell, right? I think that ideology is, I think it goes by a few different names, and I think the process of this book is to kind of pin it down and make it real, and to reveal it, because that's the tricky thing about ideologies, right? But basically, it's digital utopianism, right? If there's one thing that this book tries to dispel or create a positive view of how we can work through it and how we can figure out a way forward from the current crisis. This book's essential thesis is that problem is unchecked digital utopianism. And this pretty much has been around for well, I'd say it's antecedent. It's earlier antecedent is sort of a techno utopianism, right? This sort of blind faith that what we in the modern world call technology, further back it's just sort of known as tools, will solve our problems in the most optimal way. We shouldn't really question it, and it creates, like all utopias, it creates a unattainable vision of the future where there are no more problems, there are no more politics, everyone is happy, everyone's needs are met. And the route there is, in the case of digital utopianism, essentially the vision that Silicon Valley has exported, done a really good job marketing to us, and we have all kind of started to unknowingly enact in our daily lives because of the ubiquity of these tools. So that's digital utopianism in a nutshell. And yes, that is the book. It's about an ideology run amok.
Mm. And the object, let's say, if we can call it that, though that maybe is a sort of fallacy given what you sketch in the book, the object is the platform. The thing that embodies digital utopianism now is the platform. So before we get into dissecting all the reasons why the platform is an ideology run amok or leading us into ideologies run amok, let's first set the scene with what is a platform and how are you using it in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a platform has like a pre-digital kind of connotation and meaning. There's some things that actually shares from that. This idea that a platform is essentially like a format or almost an area in which you'd host a sort of discourse. A platform can be a sort of political platform. I think physically there's sort of a skeuomorphism going on here where it refers to getting up on a platform and sort of preaching, if you will. But when we say digital platform, we are speaking pretty much locally in terms of chronology, and also, I guess you could also say geography and a sort of political persuasion, right? So this is Silicon Valley's promise to disrupt institutions, to disrupt businesses, to really disrupt how we communicate and how we think about meaning. And their chosen form to do that, their chosen form to essentially make money, invest in products, invest in growth is the digital platform. So we'll use some basic examples. We've all used social media platforms. We've all used software platforms. Where platforms, I think, deviate from just sort of Web 1.0 internet is they attempt to centralize, lock you in, and make you use their protocols of exchange, right? So, for example, anyone can use email. Email, like the internet 1.0, is actually quite open in a way. It's not really proprietary. You'll have to obviously use some companies to get there. You'll use software to use email from a private company. But there is this idea where you can sort of connect to a server and start running your own email server. But probably from 2000 to 2010, investors realized no one really wanted to do that. No one wants to build their own thing. No one wants to host their own kind of digital architecture to do all the great things that networks do for us. So we went from this sort of internet network to homogenize and, most importantly, monopolizing platforms. Now, the other catch here is that they sort of go offline using much the same platform logic, right? So when we think of things like Uber and Airbnb, this is essentially taking the computational logic of platforms and using computation, using AI, using the ubiquity of digital devices, and taking that same logic and putting it onto sort of IRL services and goods that are provided, right? So the platform takes a very specific view of labor. It takes a very specific view of content, and it takes a very specific view of how we communicate and exchange. And I argue that is essentially kind of the form du jour, right? This is probably the past 20 years, more locally the past 10 years, we've sort of viewed this process of almost anything that Silicon Valley can get their arms around, they want to platformize. They want to turn into a platform. And of course, that means various things depending on what you're talking about. But what I do argue in the book is, as you say, the platform is the object that I most directly align with the problems of digital utopianism. Digital utopianism has problems. All utopianism has problems in various ways. It's not just technology that's the problem. It's the way that a certain ideology has impelled those that build and control technology to manifest their work, their constructions, and our kind of everyday environment into platforms.
Yeah, I want to rewind back to the question of utopianism, because I love how in the beginning of this book you lay out what the project of a utopia is, beginning with Thomas More, and I want to caveat that I want to leave open the idea that something like Murray Bookchin's ecological utopianism is maybe not an evil force or a faulty force in the way that kind of more run-of-the-mill utopianism is. But I want to invite you to share that, because I think a lot of people hear that word and they have preconceptions probably based on narratives they've encountered, books, films, etc. But there's very political, there are political through lines that you reveal with utopianism.
Yeah, absolutely. I think every ideological persuasion under the sun has, at some point or another, posited a utopia. We're all sort of guilty of utopian thinking or utopian imaginaries. They're not all bad. They make for great art. They make for, potentially, sometimes they inspire interesting movements and interesting tactics. But the thing that I isolate that I think you're referring to in the book is the more acute problem with the way that utopias essentially try to obviate the need for political movement in the present. And I think even like Marx was sort of against utopia, right? He said that there were socialist utopias before Marx, and I think there have been them since Marx. And I think part of the problem with that sort of Marxian strain of socialism was, well, we still need to enact certain things to get there, and we still need to do politics to get there, and it will take a certain movement there. What digital utopianism and techno utopianism before it does is it sort of dispenses with any of that messy political discussion or discussion of the trade-offs, and it sort of just posits this godlike dropping of a machine that will solve all the problems once and for all, right? And the other aspect of utopia that comes up over and over again is that it doesn't exist, right? It's fake. It will never exist. It is unachievable. That's both the beauty and the terror of utopianism. But the problem when digital utopians do that, first of all, they don't quite recognize that. They don't quite recognize that weakness of utopia. But what they do is they are trying to convince you that it is real, and it will be real if only you use these tools that we are selling. Interestingly enough, so yeah, there's weaknesses in utopian thinking all across the board. I just find that presently our problem is that we have so digital utopianism is so seeped into the background that we can't even recognize when it's motivating the way we're thinking and the way we're moving and the way we envision the future.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, reading the book, like I tend to think of myself as somebody who is, you know, cognizant of the ways that platform thinking, platform logics sort of invade our lives.
Of course, yeah.
And even reading the book, I mean, thinking about all the ways that this podcast will distribute,
Hmm.
and the ways that I automatically accept that, which is not to say that given the context we're in, that there's, you know, a healthy menu
Hmm.
of avenues off platform. And part of the argument that you're making in hewing toward institutions is that there's a lot of like messy social and political work involved.
Hmm.
It's not the kind of easy logic of platforms. But I guess as a maybe more like personal question for you, as you were writing this book, what was the process of interrogating your own relationship to platform logic?
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. So, I mean, reflecting on what you had just mentioned, I think no one can really escape it at this point. And there's not that's not really the problem. It's not that I don't think the problem is that we're complicit in contributing to these platforms, right? I'm not a technophobe or luddite in any sense. I realize that there are affordances to using these tools, um, and I actually don't even think about it on the individual level. Weirdly enough, and maybe that's a departure from the question. And that's kind of how I arrived at the idea of like institution building and thinking about how do we build institutions that enact the world we want to see, or the proper ethical treatment of software, or the responsible deployment of these tools, because they are powerful, right? There's no denying that. So yeah, so I did of course think about that question a lot. Um, I thought about it, especially with respect to AI, right? I mean, I wrote this book during the most fervent time of the AI hype, as you're well aware of. And I sat there and I thought, people are not even going to believe that I wrote this book, or people will say, "How do we know this isn't AI?" Or, I even had grandiose moments of being like, I don't know, if you believe the hype, they made you think that this might have been the last book ever written by a human, right? If you listen to what they're saying. So I did interrogate that aspect of it. And I also, it actually made me reflect on how important it is clearly to I mean, it almost sounds ridiculous to say, but in the face of this hype, it did make me appreciate the importance of an institution making time and space for writing and scholarship and criticism of most all, which is what I'd say my book really is. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the takeaway from my book for folks is I've heard some people say that both it inspired them to be okay with sort of using platforms, but thinking about their trade offs, and also thinking about how we can use software and some of these tools to build new institutions. But I myself am on several platforms, right? I started a Substack, and I had a very ethical moment where I said, can I use the master's tools to, disassemble the master's house? And I basically said, yeah, I think we can. I think I can. Um, the only thing I ask of people when they read my Substack or of myself is, just to be aware that, this should not be the future.
Yeah, absolutely. One way in which our careers overlap to a degree is that we've worked in and adjacent to tech. Speaking for myself, I looked at your LinkedIn, so I have a sense that we've spent a similar amount of time kind of swimming in these waters for a better part of our careers. And speaking for myself, part of what I really felt reading this book is I was confronted with earlier versions of me that fell for the phenomena you're identifying.
Mhm.
Um, maybe not to the full degree as like Mark Andreessen
Yeah.
would prefer that I do. But the operative example is I was part of the early VR and AR scene,
Mhm.
particularly the VR AR art scene. And so thinking about the ways that artists could use this tool and all of its affordances to, remedy the ills of existing platform capitalism. But
Mhm.
of course, as we could have called it, that's not how it went.
Mhm.
So I want to talk about that kind of relationship that is maybe more in the direction that is preferable for you in terms of thinking about resistance to platforms, but still ultimately falls into platform logic. The idea that a techno fix could address a social problem. Yeah, I'll throw it to you from there.
Yeah, no, I mean that's actually that's a great tee up to the answer, right? I was going to hopefully get there eventually. I've worked in technology. I partly think why this is an interesting book, and potentially different, or differentiated from some of the other technology criticism, which is amazing and incredible, and more of an academic or journalistic aspect of it. Is that, yeah, both you and I have been in the, I call it the vape smoke filled rooms, because they don't smoke cigarettes in these rooms anymore. It's vapes, where these decisions are made, and we've I talk about a few instances, but most of all, it's just this rough sketch, right, of seeing this ideology literally shoulder to shoulder, talking to folks, being somewhat of an insider outsider. But make no mistake, like I obviously bought it to a certain extent as well. I reference this in the book a few times. I was very enchanted by the idea of data science. I clearly had a different political idea of where I wanted to go. I wasn't going the Palantir route. But I mean, this stuff is cool. This stuff is powerful. This stuff is um, intellectually exciting. But of course, that's not really what Silicon Valley is trying to do, as we all know. I mean, I know it's all hindsight is 2020, but the reason I dive into this process of discovery was just to explain to folks, or to relate to folks, that none of this is set in stone. None of this is given, right? I mean, we can sort of change this trajectory, and we can talk to folks who work in tech. Like, the entire tech industry is not the enemy by any means. I think we're getting there now, although now it's kind of turning back to a point where we're very suspicious of more and more of tech companies kind of bending the knee back in that direction, right? Um, so you have ideological you have the ideological enemies in Silicon Valley, for sure. You have, and not so much enemies again, but it's just sort of, you have people who are not thinking about these tools in a way that is sort of positive sum, or is fair and equitable, and we've all heard those critiques. The technofix is really the linchpin upon the problem that I probably pulled out most most obviously from my time there, right? It was this idea where, when you're presented a problem, and in any kind of, you're running anything, you're doing anything, you have problems all the time. That's really what life is, just a bunch of problems coming at you, right? You can you can either really think about the source of the problem. You can think about the trade-offs to various solutions you have. Um, but the problem with what I saw a lot of thinking coming out of Silicon Valley is, the default idea is that we're going to fix this at the topical level, at the most almost like aesthetic individual level, and we're going to do it with essentially a piece of digital technology that sort of quote unquote magically ameliorates it, or makes it go away, or really just shifts it to someone else, right? And I think that was a very profitable gambit for many years there, both on the small scale, but also on like a large scale, right? And I think the problem with the technofix, and I have a sort of a chapter on this in the book about, I think the problem with the technofix is it's the perfect solution for digital utopians and Silicon Valley, because it helps them remove political institutions. It helps them bypass political institutions, and hopefully, I bring some light to the problems there, because I don't think it's actually quite apparent when we think about it, right? Like, we don't. I think now, only with the onset of Doge, the onset of artificial intelligence, and the third wave of the Silicon Valley backlash at this point, we start to really understand what institutions are and their value. So yeah, that's it. I encourage folks who've had similar interactions with technology, either in the industry or as a user, to think about it that way.
Mm. Yeah, I so appreciate that. And you brought up a bunch of things that I want to dive into in more detail a little bit later in the conversation, sort of build the anticipation of what some of the avenues out of this mess are. Um, Before doing that, though, I just have to ask you because I remember the Shane Snow Fix the Prison
Yes.
episode, and so I'd love for you to describe that because it's such an amazing operative example of how the Technofix goes awry.
I know when I was writing this book, I kept various folders in, various drives I've had, again, using platforms. And I was like, I know I have like obvious, like, you know, forehead slap kind of like moments of like, God, this is just so on the nose, like so ridiculous. So one of the ones that I dug up was this article, and it was widely panned at the time. And I said, I'm going to bring it back out because I feel like people forgot about this. But anyway, the article is essentially Shane Snow is, typical entrepreneur, very much I'd say an ideologue of the kind of Silicon Valley ethos, but also the technofix very specifically. And in this article that he actually posted to Medium, which back in the day was very much a thing, um, he posted this article where how we can fix the prison system, right? And I think everyone agrees the prison system is completely horrific. It needs reform. Some people say it needs abolishment. But either way, his solutions were just sort of like all of the hot toys and gadgets and gizmos and thinking about that was going on in Silicon Valley of how you solve the problem, right? So there was everything from like Tesla battery chargers to VR. Speaking of VR, I think there was something. Oh, Soylent was the other one, and it's just like was just such a. And I do feel bad, sort of like picking on it, but it really was just the perfect example, right? It was the perfect example, not just because it used all of the Silicon Valley brands and product placement and gadgets, and not just because it was sort of extremely emblematic of what it was like to be in San Francisco at that time, I imagine, um, but also because it didn't look at the problem of the prison in a larger scale, right? So, why are all these people in prison? Why are their conditions so terrible? Um, in general, what are the actual problems and complaints and issues inside prisons? Maybe talk to people that work in the system. Clearly, talk to the inmates themselves. Like instead, it was we've heard a sales pitch from 6 or 7 companies, and oh hey, I can go push it onto this like horrific situation. So yeah, that was pretty much the how Soylent and a few other Silicon Valley products can fix the prison system. And that's the problem. It's just it wasn't looking at the root of the problem. It was looking at the end user.
Mm. And that also brings up you have this term proximate cause political amnesia.
Yeah, so that's another one. So this one came up for me when I was thinking about blockchain, right? So some of the this blockchain has obviously been around for probably technically 2 decades, but really got huge. It had its first blip when like speaking of friend of the pod, Nora Khan, it had its first blip kind of during this art tech moment. I would say maybe in like 2010, 2014. I was there at Rhizome when Kevin McCoy and Anil Dash sort of sold the first NFT. That was then 10 years before NFTs blew up in 2020 or 2022, right? So there was this like early liberatory, almost leftist enthusiasm around blockchain. And I said, yeah, this is interesting. I had early reservations about it. I had early critiques of it. But I actually worked with Nora on a piece on sort of blockchain futures, right? Um, their critiques of Web 2.0 were actually really cogent. Like they were right on the money, right? They talked about the conglomeration of platforms. They talked about the problem where you kind of just expected to put everything free on the internet, and there's this kind of pseudo utopia. But that's obviously not a great deal for artists and creators. So blockchain was put out there. My problem with proximate cause political amnesia is blockchain is only solving a problem that Web 2.0 and venture capital in Silicon Valley caused, right? It only looks at in the immediate rear view window of our present problems. It doesn't go 4 or 5 steps back to ask in a deeper way, why did we arrive here, right? And there are going to be people that are going to argue with me till the ends of the earth about how blockchain could actually solve some things. And look, yeah, maybe it can. But my problem is you're just continuing the technofix digital utopian merry-go-round, right? You're just sort of simply like saying, oh, we're going to have a new tool to fix the last thing that the previous tool created. So yeah, that's where, like, for me, like 90% of blockchain stuff kind of is in this world of the technofix and this continuing digital utopianism.
One thing that came up for me when you were kind of first of all, like, that was such a nostalgic is the wrong word. It's like, speaking of platform logics, they sort your the way you remember things is informed by them in these kind of like,
Mm,
um these like kairotic instances, rather than
totally.
like, yeah, sort of but so not to get sort of too far in the kind of like woo philosophical aspects of sort of blockchain time or something, but reading that chapter, I was really confronted with those early ideals, as well as the ways that blockchain hasn't necessarily lived up to its ideals. Thinking about the folks who would maybe push back against what you're saying, of like, okay, sure, it's not addressing the root cause, but maybe we need a band-aid before we get stitches, or maybe we need a splint before we can put the leg in a cast or something. Do you have any response to that sort of like spectrum orientation to proximate cause amnesia, political amnesia, versus going straight for the root problem, which is by its sort of very nature, like sort of a wicked problem, hyper object
Of
scale
course, yeah.
fix?
Right, like climate change, right? Like,
Right.
yeah, you're not going to solve it all at once, so you might as well pick off parts that you can, and they're right, right? Here's where it breaks down for me, though, and here's where I've had some discussions, and I think there's a point that the book makes is the issue is the original idea. So my first interactions with blockchain in this conversation were with Kevin McCoy, and Kevin actually really presented the NFTs to me and to other people as this something that, I mean, I'm not exactly quoting him, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my mind originally said, oh, this is something that museums and auction houses can use. Like, now all these great digital artists can have a chain of provenance to show that, hey, you're not buying that JPEG. This is the real one, right? But what that was that was blockchain as a tool in the operating system of an institution, right? It wasn't taking blockchain where it ended up going, which is a sort of two-part highway, one into Wall Street speculation and meme coins, and the other one was back to platforms like Coinbase and all the others that kind of do the same thing, and they essentially just grab attention the same way the platforms do, except with the, technical underlying idea of this libertarian blockchain. And the reason why that happened was because, this is a topic for like 55 different books, and David Columbia's book is actually probably the best one on this. But there is an inherent libertarianness to the idea of blockchain, and I think that's partially why it went in those two directions, right? I mean, again, just to basically paraphrase, like we all know, Bitcoin essentially was about having a non-state, non-Federal Reserve version of currencies, so that we wouldn't need this kind of fiat institutional sovereignty, right, to trade, right? And it was this digital utopian idea, right? Bitcoin did its own thing, and that's largely kind of in its own lane, and it actually, I guess, has been quite successful at what it's been trying to do. um, Although I'm sure the Bitcoin purists were a little bit upset that the U.S. government is now buying Bitcoin, but that's a whole other topic. But basically, that's my thing. So to go back to answer your question, I'd say it's what I say to those folks is, you're right, but why can't we take these tools and encase them in an institution, right? Because that, to me, is not perfect, but it's the best bet we have to stop this deviation from the really the essential purpose of how I first understood distributed ledger database technology.
Mm. There's this dynamic. I don't know how much. I don't mean to bring in something that maybe doesn't factor into your research,
No,
but
it's
one
okay.
thing I was really, really thinking and feeling a lot as I was reading is feeling the weight of how Web 2.0, particularly under the brand of neoliberalism that the Obama years progressed, and that the recovery from the recession really brought to the fore, which Yanis Varoufakis has written a lot about, and I know you reference him in the book. But how platforms really are this is what I was feeling. I'm not meaning to put words in your mouth. The enclosure of digital space. Literally the way that land was enclosed from being public land 200 years before, in a way that very much echoes how labor and political ideology, labor was privatized, and particular political and economic philosophies were prioritized. Was any of that feeding into your research, or am I just kind of like going further afield?
No, it was. So I'm I'd say the thinkers that clearly influenced me are dotted throughout the book, but you have Jenny Morozov was an obvious one. He's inescapable. Um, and then Yanis Varoufakis, like I will admit, like I haven't yet gotten to that book. However, I am. It's on my list. It's in my cart. Um, but I would say the ideas of techno-feudalism have antecedents before that book, and I think they've been floating around for a really long time. I mean, I think Josh Citarella and I were talking about something like this several years ago as well. It's been a strain in kind of like platform capitalist studies or critical text studies. I think the idea of techno-feudalism, if I could take the question slightly in a different direction, is the reason why it's interesting is because like there were really no like modern democratic institutions in feudalism, as I understand it, and it was sort of this like Hobbesian sort of situation, right, where it was just kind of like it was just sort of like the survival of the most powerful lord. There were no real, as I said before, kind of like checks and balances. It was very much like a serf economy, right? So I think that the strains are there, and I actually do buy into that argument. Like I do think that there are similarities to where we're going. I'd say that where I maybe think I agree with some of the critiques of the idea of techno-feudalism, which is, again, I would really want to see how this is laid out in the book. But for me, it is just capitalism, first of all, right? Famously not around during the feudal times, or maybe just kind of coming into view, depending on where in the period you're talking about. But yeah, no, I sort of think like it's just sort of capitalism, sort of unchecked. But when I look at a lot of the things that Elon Musk is proposing and are now around the network state, that are basically now being enacted on the federal state in this sort of transition period, I do believe that his vision and the ideology that he represents and is enacting does want to take us to something that's probably closer to like a feudal state. And the reason why is because they're elevating the idea in the way that feudalism potentially only answered to the Christian God and essentially just survival. They are answering to this sort of either like AI God or this like God of technological progress. And then like every other decision in how you sort of, manage the commons is in service to that, rather than what essentially I'd say modern democratic statehood does to a citizen. So I see it there, and it definitely fed into my thinking in the book.
Yeah, the Dark Enlightenment ideology and the effective accelerationism that you get into in the book. Those belief systems, which connect to like Balaji's network state that you referenced, are it's funny, they're the types of ideologies that can only really emerge under what we might loosely call global democracy, but they are so authoritarian in nature because of how they enact capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an adjacent question to this, which is like, let's say in a vacuum, because as you aptly described, life is just problems coming at you, and most people are acting in good faith. I would say somebody like Elon Musk is not acting in good faith, but most people are acting in good faith. So let's say that like we could run simulations of different kinds of answers or responses to those problems. Is there a version in that sort of sketch of simulations where you could have platforms and institutions operating both side by side and in integrated ways that wouldn't be problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think I am an optimist, despite, the critical tone of the book, right? I think, and I'm actually trying to work on this as an ongoing project, partly in speaking to folks like you. Absolutely. I think when I think of institutions using technology, and when I say institutions, I mean everything from like a big bank to a, a university to a museum, to any kind of institution, even something like the courts, the legal system, right? So it is a broad term, which I need my readers to kind of understand. But I do think there was a world in which we got it reversed, right? We institutions looked at these shiny new tools over the past 20 years, and they used the tools, but they also used the ideology. They also essentially bought the idea that software should be in the foreground, and essentially a libertarian deinstitutionalization should infect the institution, right? The most overt place this has happened is in the museum, where I think you see instances of people wanting to adopt technologies to increase education or user experience, but what they forgot to figure out was there is something special. There's parts of the museum as an institution, part of the institution of art is a feature, not a bug, right? It's not a problem to be solved, right? So I think that if I do share this. I'm not going to call it utopia, but I do share this future optimist vision of all of these institutions still enacting their mission without being disintermediated, hollowed out, or essentially just defunded by this larger kind of austerity drive that we're now seeing come out of Silicon Valley, like both like intellectually, but also like literally in terms of lawmaking now, and like all these different things coming out of the Trump administration. So a little bit more of how that looks. AI is an interesting tool, right? It can help you with some things, right? I don't think we should be banning AI. I think we should have much different types of voices thinking about how we use it, both for like art making, but also for like doing your middle management desk job. We don't want to do a globalization 2.0 where we sort of just say it's cheaper to get everything done automated in an automated way. So therefore, we should follow that logic. That's what's being sold with AI, right? They're not really selling you the interesting cognitive stuff it does. They're not really selling, certainly not selling the AI art, I don't think, but they're not selling you the ability to help you think, despite the marketing that I see, or to make you flourish more. That's how they're marketing it, but really what they're trying to do is they're saying like, look, we can just replace wholesale parts of the value chain of multiple institutions in enough society, right? So it's incompatible in that sense, but it's 100% compatible in the sense of like we could be using it like we use blockchain to verify a digital image, or the way we kind of use tools today in certain senses, where it's not fundamentally anathema to like the mission of what we're trying to do. So yeah, that future exists.
Mm, mm. So you've addressed kind of the question of institutions from a lot of different dimensions thus far, and I'd love to like let's center that conversation. So why is, in your view, the institution, maybe not, I don't like using answer, I don't like using like solutions language for many of the reasons you outline in the book, but why is it the appropriate response? Like, why is recentering institutions the appropriate response to escape us from the hegemony of platform logic?
Yeah, it's a central question of the book, and it's a really good, difficult question. There's a few reasons. One is I think the solutions that we've been proposed to the degradations of platform capitalism, to me, are mostly just more platforms and a different type of capitalism, like a nicer platform or a nicer capitalism. I somewhat reject that pretty much, right? I don't think that's going to be what we need, right? I'll use the quick example of Twitter is obviously has a number of problems now, and people are fleeing. Well, what are they fleeing to? They're fleeing to Blue Sky, or they're fleeing to something else. They're fleeing to potentially Discord servers. But for me, the answer is going back to like the first principles, going back to sort of just 4 or 5 steps in the value chain of the problem. Is what do we really want? What are we really missing? Twitter never really did it for us, even though we all got addicted. It wasn't this global town square. It didn't have the institutionalness that it said it might. It didn't perform the same political and cultural virtues and missions that it set out to do. It actually destroyed those in many cases, right? So what I'd say is, yes, you can use slightly better platforms. There's no problem with that. To your point before, but I think the key to really getting out of this doom loop is reimagining and reconstituting what we mean and what we mean when we say institutions, and really kind of like engaging in like a philosophical, I guess, political philosophy branch of thinking about like what we mean when we say institutions and what institutions do in our lives. I think a lot of the post Silicon Valley backlash has sort of led us to that, right? We almost couldn't see the value of these things before they were sort of ripped out or hollowed out. So yeah, I mean that's sort of the main idea. And then in terms of just like thinking about what I mean when I say the virtues of an institution, again, kind of a large spectrum of things I mean there. But I'd say like the things that are at the heart of it are, institutions care about what they're doing and what they're putting out there. They believe in the mission and the thing. Everything from like a hospital is good because of very obvious reasons of the public good, to an art museum does something for the sake of art or for the sake of the public sphere and enriching that. So I'm asking for a little bit more of a humanist view of all of these problems, right? I think institutions don't need to grow. They don't need to take over institutions. They don't need to scale. They just are, and they enact their missions there. Platforms are obviously the opposite. Platforms don't care what's on the rails. They don't care if there are Nazis on Substack. They don't care, if Facebook got rid of their fact checkers, because that's not really the point of Facebook. The point of Facebook is we sell ads, Senator, as Mark Zuckerberg said, right? So that is really why I think the institution will have a comeback, or at least we'll have a renaissance of us thinking about this in a positive light, as opposed to what happened in the 20th century, which was 20th century was a history of us just like crapping on institutions for good reason because they were terrible. But what we did was we just got rid of them wholesale instead of trying to reform them.
Mm. Yeah, that was one thing that I wanted to go a little deeper with you on is what in your framing is the like platonic ideal of the institution, because obviously, as you just said, this is a pretty broad spectrum. The fact that it can hold within it, a bank, the post office, and sort of anything in between, I think is where the argument finds its greatest trouble, I would say.
Yeah,
And so that I found myself wanting like a little bit more meat on that bone of like, what are the like, what's the quintessential example? And also beyond the quintessential example, what's the, to carry a tech term, what's the minimum spec for something to be an institution versus being something that's more hybrid or being a platform?
yeah. So one thought I have is, I don't know if this is the perfect example, but I think it's something we can work with. Is like a public park is kind of the closest thing to that platonic ideal of an institution. Like, why is a park an institution? Because if it weren't institutionalized, developers would build whatever they want on it. A park is an institution because it serves a collective body. Anyone can kind of go in and go out. There's no commercial aspect to it. That's not to say that institutions can't be commercial, and that's not to say that institutions can't be profitable. A park also has to raise money. A park also has to not raise money, but essentially fund itself, right? A park is something that can be used in many different ways and allows individuals and groups to go in and sort of make it their own. It is a support for an activity. It is not trying to draw in activity and monetize it, or it is not trying to monopolize your attention or monopolize your use of it or your use of other parks. There are many parks in a city, and you can go to any one of them, and they just kind of sit there. They don't need to grow. They don't go away when you turn it off. They're just always there, right? So that's kind of like one of the things I'm kind of I hate to say vibe, but like vibing with when I think of like the perfect institution. Like no one's ever put that question to me that way, and I think it's a great question. So that's probably like really close. But then yeah, I'm also kind of working on like a list which I haven't yet memorized, so forgive me. Of but I did publish it actually. Of what are the sort of stack order rank, like what are the most important focuses of an institution versus a platform, right? And so I think one of the biggest ones is institutions are about, first of all, are sort of mission driven, right? They have a purpose, they have an intent, right? Because platforms don't really have intent; they just need to sort of grow, and like anything that happens on it is really not their concern, unless it threatens the growth or the algorithm that helps it optimize, right? Um, the other one would be the idea of existing for a collective, right? So, when you think about a magazine, a lot of people put out a magazine. A lot of people put out make art collectively. When I write something on Substack, it's pretty much just me, right? Yeah, you can employ people on Substack, but the whole idea of Substack is around this like individual writer. And it's because it's saying, oh, you've been cast out. Now you're an entrepreneur. Now you're doing it all yourself. Now you're doing all these pieces. And I feel this very viscerally when I write for Substack as opposed to like some of the processes I've been through with like traditional institutions. What is the reason for that? The reason for that is because our oft maligned and correctly somewhat criticized media ecosystem, did have this idea that we were putting out something together and we were putting out something for the good of the public discourse, right? On Substack, it's all about monetizing. It's all about optimizing. It's all about maximizing, like sort of what you do. Like it affects what you write, of course. And yes, there are examples of like amazing stuff and like beautiful things that have been flowering from that. But my point is like that's also the point of the institution that it tried to replace, right? So those would be like really like the core aspects. The third one that's probably worth mentioning is I maybe think of it as like one of the pillars is just a disinterest in scale, right? So I think we've all had examples of when the underlying imperative of growth for growth's sake or growth at all costs, right, has come in and infected the kind of like idea of what a platform does to its users and its work, right? Institutions don't need to grow, right? Because again, they can be profitable, they can make a ton of money in whatever they're doing, but that's not exact like growth is not the reason for them to exist. They're existing to serve their constituents as long as their constituents are nominally satisfied.
Mm. Yeah, I'm thinking about a couple things come to mind. Like one, how Instagram was like a whiskey rating app before this major pivot. Just to your point about how a platform really can be anything as long as it's
Mhm.
got the eyeballs. But oh wait, what was the other thing I was thinking of? I just totally lost my train of thought.
Wait, what do
Oh,
you mean by that? Instagram was whiskey, right? What does that mean?
before Instagram was Instagram, it was like a whiskey. I'm forgetting like what particularly it did around whiskey, but it was like a niche whiskey app.
Really? I never
And
knew
then they
that.
just did this whole rebrand to like to be this kind of like Polaroid style.
That's so
It was named something different, but it's all the same people. It's like when the band,
yeah. That's
uh,
so funny.
you know, yeah, but it sort of makes me think of what you're saying. And then also there's this really wonderful graphic essay called "We Call It Paula."
Hmm.
Have you encountered this essay?
No.
I'd recommend it to everyone. It's kind of taking on the idea of like the for good psilocybin company,
Okay.
because that's obviously like a big vector right now. And it's basically sketching how these great intentions to like heal the world get co-opted ultimately by all the, forces of venture capital and
Hmm.
ultimately going public and competition and needing to have a moat and the ways in which once you have a board, they can displace senior leadership unless you act certain ways. So it's like, it creates this like structural mess. And what I love about what you're advocating for with institutions is that it's as Ilya Prigozhin says, it's a small island of coherence that can maybe have these nth order systems effects that
Yeah.
change the broader system.
Hmm.
I think in order for it to have that impact, I want to kind of look at the dimension of critique from the right and the left.
Hmm.
So I want to start with the one that I'm obviously less aligned with, which is the critique from the right, which I feel like dispatch pretty effectively in the book, which is around this idea of like, well, institutions stifle innovation. If we If we stop the market activity of platforms, we'll stifle innovation. Why, for those who believe in that, would you argue that that would not be the case in foregrounding institutions?
Oh, this is like almost too easy, but I mean, the internet was started by the federal government and the U.S. intelligence service. So there's that one, right? Like that was an institution. That was all public money, right? I don't go into that history in the book. I just like, kind of like talk about it because there's like 50 amazing books on that, and I'm not a scholar in that area. But yeah, I mean that's the first one, right? This all started to connect military bases and connect universities. Actually, it was universities at first. They were the first internet, and it was actually for scholars to share, data. So that's that one. But then the other one would be, I hate to break it to Silicon Valley, and they know this, but they'll never say it. But a lot of their money comes from the federal government, right? It's lots of Tesla subsidies out there that we're learning more and more about now.
Oh, and SpaceX.
Yeah, SpaceX, right? And that's not bad, right? Like I'm not totally as long as they're not being disingenuous about it, which they are. I'm not totally opposed to the government funding private research. Like clearly that's going to happen. I don't want it all completely government controlled economy, although some days maybe I do. But yeah, no, I think that's the thing, right? I just think that's a false narrative, right? I think those two data points are something that they have to answer back to, right? I think it's just kind of that's really where the libertarianness of the history of Silicon Valley kind of creeps in and like has been manifesting itself, right? There's this idea that the government and big bureaucracies can't do stuff. Well, I say, well, let's just make them better. Like let's maybe retool bureaucracies, or let's inspire people to think that they can, because they actually can. And there's actually a whole new, I think, very recent movement around that. It's almost like anti-Doge, which is saying the government can position itself as an agent of innovation, or the government can have this future vision, or sort of this like future oriented, like we can do big things vision, because we have done big things, right? Like the New Deal, like the Great Society, like there's just tons of other examples. So yeah, it's out there.
A couple things that kicked up for me. One, just to continue your point around the internet, the web was also an open source offering from CERN,
Yeah.
also an institution.
Oh, that's another one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So not only the internet, but also the Rails,
Yeah,
and of course, Mark Andreessen wants to take all the credit for
Yeah.
inventing the web with Netscape. But of course, Tim Berners-Lee was adamant that it remain open source, and so that protocol, as you said, there are still there's still a merchant layer of like selling domains and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But anybody can operate on those protocols without having to interface with a platform. Like you have the choice of how you operate on the internet and also how you operate on the web.
Mm-hmm.
And so like making websites remains to this day. You can do it through Squarespace or Wix or whatever, but it remains something that you could just do on your own.
Yeah.
If you have the will and the interest.
For now.
For now, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Hopefully for much longer, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, there's a whole chunk that I want to just spend talking about, like the burgeoning hellscape. But I want to stay focused on the sort of here and now of platforms for just a little bit longer. Thinking about the critique from the left. So you've brought up libertarianism in the terms of Silicon Valley, which is right libertarianism.
Mm-hmm.
There's also libertarian anarchists who, that's a left-wing ideology that basically holds that, there shouldn't be state domination. They would look at something like the advocacy for institutions and say, well, the lineage of institutions that it seems like you might most be drawing upon is the kind of like noblesse oblige of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, which is its own kind of domination in another name. So what do you say to that critique of the institutional argument?
Yeah, no, it's something that's come up a good amount. So yeah, first of all, I think the blanket caveat statement that I make several times in the book and almost on every podcast is I'm not advocating to return to the institutions, to the noblesse oblige concept, which yes, clearly is kind of like ghosting around in the background, because that's how we think of this term, most particularly in the creative fields, right? I would say that there are examples of when I sort of like look at, not that I'm advocating for this model, but like just to show that it's possible, right? Um, the Soviet Union had institutions. It was not afraid to sort of take power, right? Like the early Bolshevik Revolution, was very clear that they were just going to basically take most of the institutions that were capitalist institutions. They were going to save their end products, but they were going to reconfigure them to be centered around worker power, right? Like so, what the constructivists did with modern art, right, or in early kind of like industrial art, and they were essentially technicians in a lot of ways. Like you could argue the Bauhaus did the same thing, although that's like a lot more complicated. Um, so I would just say that, um, you know, kill the doomer in your mind that says that all authority inherently corrupts. And yes, it's very difficult, and it will take political action. But I'm really asking someone to make a bit of a leap of faith, I guess, right? To say that there is the possibility where taking power, having authority, is something we shouldn't really be afraid of on the left. One might argue that's one of the problems why we're in this position, right? Like, why does no one just start a, let's just call it, left party in America, right? Why do we have to, like, trade our best players to the Democrats, and then they ended up getting subsumed into that morass, right? Like, we could just
Yeah.
start our own thing, right? Um, and yeah, like, you have, again, just in my exact example, like, you have great reason to be suspicious of sort of elite capture and institutional corruption, and the way in which it sort of just is, reproduces the conditions that it needs, and it doesn't really move forward, right? So yeah, I mean, there does need to be a serious break, and there does need to be a serious um, reconstitution of what we think of institutions, and also how they act, for this to happen. So that's largely how I think. And I think most people on the left would see what I'm saying, right? Like they'll be receptive to that vision, I believe. But that they have to kind of take this picture in their mind that they have of the past and kind of erase it, essentially.
Mm. One thing that kicks up for me that I've been thinking a lot about is, and I'm not alone, and lots of people have been talking about this, is the role of folks on the left,
Mhm.
and by that I'm kind of just carving the Democratic Party out of that
Yeah.
conversation, um, to not to carry the Silicon Valley parlance, but to be builders.
Hmm.
Um, Folks on the left are very good at learning and very good at critique.
Hmm.
Though I think that also comes into a sort of zone of the conversation that I was excited to get into with as well, which is your background as an art critic and a tech critic, but also the ways in which you see that language being, pun intended, critical for how we kind of sense make and escape platform logic.
Hmm.
So there's a kind of messy question here that I
Yeah.
can't really put a fine point to, which is like, what is that relationship in your mind, both in terms of how you, the responsibility you put on yourself as a critic and what role you see playing, and also what's the broader role of the left to kind of take this mantle to build institutions, maybe based on critique, but not leave it at pure critique.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been wrestling with this a lot. And, the first thing I'll say is, books have to decide what lane they're going to be in, and decide where the book's going to end, right? And so early on, I thought, like, there are plenty of books that are sort of a how-to, or there are plenty of books that are giving examples. But I sort of specifically chose this book to live in the critical zone, or the critical. And when I say critical, I mean in terms of how it's written, but also the point of what the reader is supposed to get, and what's supposed to awaken in the reader, right? It's supposed to essentially zero in on ideologies, right? Um, my overall answer to this is, if we don't understand and fix the ideological head of which all of these appendages grow, we will kind of be in a sort of like, I don't think it's Medusa, it's the other one. We'll be in the situation where we're just cutting off limbs, and it's still kind of like writhing around, and it just kind of grows more limbs, right? So that's kind of my first, not defense, but that's my first answer, right? Is this book is focused on ideology, and for better or for worse, ideology essentially is a product of language, right? And it's essentially like a literary being, and that's where the book plays. Overall, though, the larger institution of critique, or the institution of, being critical, being a hater, only pointing out the bad stuff and not really doing anything, this is so rampant in Silicon Valley, right? It's everywhere. The man in the arena. Every founder loves the man in the arena thing. Like, every time you see someone post a man in the
Yeah.
arena thing to Twitter, something bad is about to happen, because brilliant thinker Theodore Roosevelt, I believe. Um, that's kind of the most quoted thing he's ever done. And I think, yeah, it's because I think I get into this in the book. I think before you can hire people to build, to go out there to enact, you really got to solve this first ideological problem. So that's kind of where I think criticism plays a role. So I actually reject people that say criticism is not enough. I don't think that's true. I hear what you're saying. It doesn't get anything done. It doesn't necessarily change anyone's life immediately, but it's part of a process, right? It's part of a historical process that, look, the neoliberals did this. They started out with papers and think tanks. The Silicon Valley certainly did this. They started out with think tanks. They infiltrated, you might say, the university system. It takes time. But yeah, no, I mean, I've worked in tech. Like, I get it. Like, I've shipped stuff, right? Like, I know what they're saying. They're basically saying, like, oh, well, what should we build? I have a few, I don't know, okay answers to that, but I'm just kind of situating my critique in that early ideological part.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's that classic quote of "a problem well stated is half solved."
Yeah, exactly.
And I so resonate with what you're saying around, like, sort of getting the head right, in the sense that, yeah, like, the network state, that's like a 3-year-old philosophy. Accelerationism has its roots in, Nietzsche and some older philosophy, but that too is only a couple decades old as like a philosophy that we call accelerationism. Yeah, all the sort of spin-offs of that, like effective altruism, long-termism, effective acceleration, like, all of those things are all relatively new ideas. Like, you bring up even neoliberalism is a new idea in the scheme of
Yeah.
the human species. I think the battle that we're up against, if you identify, on the left, is the clear advantage that they have is that those philosophies are aligned with power and aligned with the concentration
Yeah,
of wealth.
that's the problem.
We don't have that benefit. Yeah. Do you have any ideas of how we build robust institutions absent that appeal to power?
Yeah, I mean, you hit at the core of the Death Star here, right? Like, if we make this shot, like, we get it, right? But there's, like, just the opening is, like, very small. I talk about this in the book, right? I think Josh Citarella has this pseudo satirical idea for state book, which is basically, for listeners who don't know, in a nutshell, it's the idea that the post office basically runs Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest and email and all the stuff you use. It's not a venture capital Silicon Valley private company. It's exactly the way they, by the way, quite Herculean, in a quite Herculean way, run the U.S. postal system. But we're just not impressed by that anymore. I raised that in the book because there's a kernel of truth there, right? What if the only real way to do this is through a sort of public structure? What if it is through state-funded sources? I think that is the most viable answer to your well-stated problem of, it's very easy to get money to write books about the free market. It's very easy to get to do various media about the network state, because it's just aligned with capital. It's aligned with power right now, right? So yeah, the big question for the left is who's going to both support in a non-material way, but also, unfortunately, support in a material way these new structures and these new institutions. I don't love that our only answer is the state, and of course that's just my brain trying to kind of work through this problem. There's got to be other ones there, but I mean, for me, it's that kind of insulation right now in the 20th century is what I think of. I think maybe the 21st century will produce some other type of an encasement or encapsulation kind of mechanism, where you can transcend the class interests of everyone who's involved in sort of funding and backing this kind of stuff.
Mm. I not to sort of carry the metaphor of using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, but it also occurs to me that another model that maybe would alleviate some of the concerns of like state controlled institutions would be something akin to the Fed,
Hmm.
where it's created by the government, but
Yeah.
then it becomes mostly
Hmm.
autonomous. Of course, who knows if that will
Hmm.
persist. As another way of thinking about, yeah, having a mission, having a clear intent, not having a profit motive, but unlike the Fed,
Yeah.
not necessarily directly trafficking in
Well,
currency.
another thing I'll propose, which you maybe think of, but I've also been toying with as well, is we first have to change our cultural imagination that sort of working for the government or working for one of these things or these institutions is, somehow in our current value system, in many ways just sort of not valorized, right? It took like 300 years for us to get to the point where we have this American free market individualism. That project is now bearing fruit. Like that's exactly why we have this situation where our robber barons are buying the Washington Post and then pretty much immediately saying, okay, we're only going to publish free market stuff, right? So there's a world. I don't want to say that Europe's better at this necessarily, but there is a possibility that over time, people wouldn't have these negative associations with working for a bureaucracy, or even that a bureaucracy is running the show. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be the state per se. Maybe we can just change our entire connotations of what that would mean.
Mm. Well, that very naturally segues us to the hellscape, because what that makes me think of is what is all caveats that for whom and in what circumstances, but what is widely regarded as the um, best, both in terms of most favorable to a middle class, but also the most productive under the
Mhm.
terms of neoliberalism. Sort of, well, I guess it wasn't neoliberalism at the time, but under the terms of
Right.
capitalism, best GDP productivity was the period of essentially democratic socialism that occurs between the 40s and
Mhm.
the 70s, early 80s. That occurred on the heels of the Great Depression, and to gloss a lot of history, that could happen because the situation was so desperate that the middle class had to be propped
Mhm.
up. And it makes me wonder if we are now entering, and this is not to glass half full the situation, but it makes me wonder if your book is a well-timed intervention, because we are entering a time. I mean, hell, we could be entering another depression. But even leaving that aside, the attacks on particularly federal workers right now, I am witnessing a sort of backlash of like, oh, the NOAA does that, park rangers do that. Like, people who never once thought of federal workers are now seeing the sort of full spread of what federal workers did, monitoring infectious diseases around the world, like all these services that you take totally for granted, but now you're visibly seeing, and you're seeing them because they're being destroyed. Do you sense any of that? This is my way of opening up into the sort of Musk Trump,
Yeah, absolutely. I think
pairing.
to I've been thinking of this exact thing, so it's so fortuitous that you literally set me up to do this layup, but or I think of it as a slam dunk. But yeah, we might need a digital new deal, right? Or we might have a new deal for the platform era, right? So it's not breadlines necessarily like it was in the 30s and 20s, but it's sort of culturally we're losing meaning. Like we don't like that we're all addicted to this stuff. We've seen how platforms expanding unchecked has killed off all these institutions. To use the media as just one example, potentially there is some sort of like literally new deal to say, to feed into your point of like that actually set up prosperity, that was actually ended up being very much free market prosperity, because it cared so much about something that was, um, often just ignored. Which in the New Deal, it was sort of like the idea of having a middle class job and having essentially like a way to put a roof over your head. These are all like capitalist ideas. but they were kind of like worked in with this sort of like Keynesianism, right? So yeah, I think that's what we're going to probably that's what's going to happen. Yeah, to your point, I'm seeing the same exact thing, and I'm feeling weirdly optimistic about this, the pendulum swinging back, right? This is partially my point about institutions. Like you don't, they're not sexy until they're gone, right? And then you're like, oh, okay. Um, Silicon Valley is not painting this picture. Elon Musk is not painting this picture. I think in Elon Musk's case, though, here's the danger in this, though, is that if they just get rid of certain institutions, there's almost no pendulum to swing back upon. Like they're getting rid of the whole clock, right? So we have to keep fighting there. But yeah, no, I 100% see this. I 100% see this book as being weirdly. I mean, I didn't know he was gonna. I didn't know Trump was gonna win, and I didn't know Elon Musk was gonna be the shadow president. But it does feed exactly into this conversation, as you brought up so perfectly. Right? Like I think that there will be a movement back, and that what happens in that pendulum swing is like really important, right? I hope that, like I say, we don't just go build different platforms, or we don't just raise another round of venture to fix the problem. I hope we think about, maybe the answer is not exactly what it was under Biden, because that wasn't great for people either. But yeah, there has to be this progressive move forward, that it does include technology, but does like the New Deal did, like stick up for the stuff that is not necessarily always front and center in our media ecosystem.
Mm. I love the idea of a digital New Deal. Are there any other details you can? I know you're sort of in the middle of kind of sketching that, but any other details you can share on what your thinking is
Yeah,
there?
no, I had one idea around, potentially. I hate to use like taxes to to get stuff done, but one sort of very palatable idea here would be sort of like, there was this I wrote my thesis about the New Deal art projects, actually, and it's exactly the same situation, right? Like it was, first of all, there was widespread unemployment, but also there was a problem in the sort of like art system. And back then, art was very much like illustration. Like think about like early photography, things like that. Like even like writing and like just doing history and documenting. Like so, the New Deal art projects were this idea that we're going to employ unemployed artists so they can eat, but it was also about creating this this kind of like, the scholars call it like a usable past, right? It was about like telling the story of America and like employing artists to do that. And the important missing part that we don't have today is this valorization of the artist, like the understanding of the importance of the arts and the humanities. And so it was saying like, look, the private market just completely crashed out, these universities and all of these and the sort of art ecosystem. So the federal government will kind of come in and essentially fund it via the New Deal. I think we'll probably have something similar today, but the players are switched, right? Potentially, we have some sort of like tax on platforms, right? Or tax on AI. So, like 1% of the revenue of AI companies that goes into this sort of like fund. And then this fund essentially becomes, the Rockefellers or, the Wall Street barons that kind of did culture in like the late 2000s or the late 20th century. And it doesn't have to be thought of as a government thing, but what it's essentially doing is it's saying, look, we know that Substack and all these different platforms and Facebook are essentially have expropriated a bunch of free labor from artists and really just any kind of economic activity. So let's kind of like take that back. And if you think about like 1% of some of these evaluations, 1% of some of this revenue actually could be life changing for regional areas that don't have any support for any kind of like arts ecosystem, and not even arts ecosystem, just like any kind of newspapers, any kind of institutional concern that we talked about earlier could be kind of funded through this. And I think people would largely be on board for that, because people are starting to see the degradation that a pure platform world is starting to wreak.
Mm. It also, this is sort of an adjacent thought, but have you seen any of the writing about red chip art?
Yes, I read that the other day. I did. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So how does that play in your mind? Like, do you see that being something that would maybe also like likewise reveal certain degradations?
Well, I mean, yeah. So this brings up, I mean, I think where you're going with this is this brings up the touchy subject of sort of like, elitism and judgment and, right, like, But I mean, I guess, let me say this: the New Deal art projects, like most of the stuff they did, was we look back on it and we say like, ooh, wasn't exactly avant garde, or it wasn't exactly interesting, it wasn't really cool, right? But what it was an expression of the American people. It was an expression of, a lot of it was like cityscapes and the, sort of the working class, because it was art for the people, right? I don't think red chip art is art for the people, was my reading of it, right? I think it's sort of just more like a more vulgar, ridiculous kind of like crypto adjacent new robber baron aesthetic that's happening right now. And I think that's, I mean, we, before the internet was invented, art was going in that direction too, right? So I think there's got to be some middle ground there.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's too nascent to get into too much, but I'd love to maybe have you back in like a year when we've seen what red chip
Yeah, we
art
should do
looks
that.
like, because your background in criticism, I think, is really key there. Thinking about Elon Musk and Doge, one thing that I've been really, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised at this point, but that I've been really surprised by is there's a number of people who genuinely believe that that will lead to good outcomes. So I think to start this exploration, is your sense that Doge dismantling federal bureaucracy will save the American people money and lead to better efficiency?
No, absolutely not. I think I don't, and also I think that um, I'm not necessarily opposed to sort of making government more efficient, or making government even potentially upgraded, right? I mean, I think during the Obama administration, and then through, I think it was also in Trump one, and then Biden, there was the U.S. Digital Service, right? It was kind of doing what Josh was talking about with the with Statebook, right? It's saying like, all right, basic digital infrastructure needs to be put into our federal government, because our federal government does serve constituents, right? It serves people. Where they take it, though, is this just like utter caricature of the fact that everything in the government is paper based, everything is slow, bureaucrats are lazy. That's not why that we need to bring in digital tools. They're doing it because they want to remove the regulatory state, right? They essentially want to get rid of these institutions because, one, and a very old tale, they think the private sector can do it better. Two, slightly more new tale, they think AI is going to make all of this obliterated and useless. So, I mean, that's where Elon Musk is going. He's using the libertarian small government people as the sort of ideological base here. And look, that's fertile ground. Like, there's not a person in America who can say they've had 100% user satisfaction with the federal government or even state government, right? It's just not how it happens. But I think there's something very important philosophically. Like, that's not what it's for. It's not supposed to delight you, right? It's not. It's not supposed to. It's not supposed to be like a. It doesn't exist to be a delightful user experience, consumer experience. It exists because it's governing men and women and families, and protecting us, like, right, it's a very important distinction that I think is not being made, right? So Doge is going to be a calamity, and I hope, like you say, it somehow leads to like a backlash.
Mm. It also has me thinking a lot, maybe getting into the more philosophical dimensions that we left off with earlier, about the role of velocity
Mm.
in government, but also just like large scale societal life. How are you thinking about, because what's happening with Doge is happening at this like blitzkrieg speed, and I'm using that term pretty advisedly. Some people are really excited by that speed.
Mhm.
You're describing the ways in which government ought to be slower. Um, but yeah, how are you thinking about that dynamic between speed and
Yeah.
slowness?
So yeah, I mean, I have a chapter about this in the book, right? It's like basically about like clock speeds, right? So I think that institutions have a clock speed that is set at the needs of the institution, right? It is not determined by the technology that you use. It's determined by the thing that it does. Computing, the history of computing, and Silicon Valley platforms try to do everything they can do to speed up the clock as fast as possible. And then what they do is they say anything that's using it now needs to answer to that, or needs to be sort of led by the idea of an asynchronous production. Like, everything fires at once, it goes as fast as possible. And so you have like asynchronous productions, or asynchronous kind of community or communication on all of our platforms. And something like Uber and Airbnb only work because they allow different like sort of capital resources to be asynchronously kind of shared. And of course, this is not a communitarian exercise. This is a collective, or this is a centralization for-profit exercise where the platform sort of takes it all, right? So yeah, I mean, I think we have to get better about understanding the timescales of different things we do, and just essentially, allowing that patience to be part of what an institution kind of protects, right? Maybe going back to your other question, like another thing on the institution pillar is really that it makes time, it creates time, it sort of supports productive time in a way that is not productive in the sort of capitalist Fordist sense, but productive in the sense of it is enabling someone to create something that would not have existed if it were not for this institution. I think in the world we live in now in Silicon Valley platforms, when we think of like uploading slop to the internet, or just creating various memes and things like this, like that's that's online culture, because that's the clock speed, that's the affordance of of what you are essentially impelled to put on there, right? So this becomes very, very overt and almost black and white, almost like when you think about the role of government, the role of a democracy, the role of deliberation. I'll never forget, like I took a really great course on like the theory of Congress and how Congress works, and it's like the point is that they don't pass a lot of bills. Like that's the point. Like gridlock is good, right? Like you're supposed to get things in gridlock, because what that process is doing is essentially democracy in action. It's essentially a bunch of different things. And look, it's corrupt as hell, right? But theoretically, it's okay if a bill takes a long time and it's thought about, right? In Silicon Valley, that's not the way Silicon Valley works. Silicon Valley says there's a user problem, instantly fix it, press a button, instant gratification, and a techno fix at that, right? So I think we need to talk more about that as you said, like the role in which time and clock speed plays a factor.
You brought up slop. You talk about the gray web in the book as well, and I don't even know the question to ask, other than I just want to get you to reflect on it, because I've been seeing reels, actually, to carry a platform idea about what so I teach a category of coursework called creative critical AI. So I unfortunately inflict these reels upon myself, because I'm going to try to see what the edges of how it's being used are, good and bad, mostly bad. And in that sort of bad dimension is the kind of like rise and grind hustle culture usage of slop, where now it's actually starting to live into the idea of the dead internet theory, where people are using AI avatars as like affiliate marketing sort of shotguns across the internet. And I think everybody's essentially going to be worse for it. Either you get suckered into spending money you wouldn't spend, or discoverability, which was already bad for people, gets worse. And I don't, other than a visceral counter reaction among a number of people, I'm having a lot of trouble seeing how like digital life gets any better. Like, how do we sort of push back against the slop apocalypse? What's your feeling about slop right now? And like, what do we do about slop is, I guess, the question I'll wrap that into.
I wouldn't call it a prediction, but I have a observation that I think in the future we're going to start to see AI free stickers on stuff, right? We're going to start to see real human stickers on it. And I cringe at that a little bit, right? Like I don't want that, but like that's going to happen, right? Like, I don't know if you feel this way, but like it's been 2 or 3 years of this right now, right? With a really powerful Gen AI. I look at something now, and in a split second in my brain, in my eye, I'm like, is it real or not, right? And by the way,
Yeah.
I've bragged about this on Twitter. I'm actually pretty good. Like that art test that came out, like I did pretty well on it. I got fooled. Everyone gets fooled, but yeah, I mean, like there's ways to see if it's fake. You always kind of look at they're not very good at landscapes, so and they're not good at architecture. So I'm sure it'll get better. But like right now, I'm looking at slop on Facebook or Instagram, and I'm like, oh yeah, there it is. It's fake, right? And what that conditions us to do is really, I think, horrible, right? We're now doubting. We're having this anxiety in every single thing we see online, not in real life, right? So that's going to turn people off, right? There's also this other thing where, I saw that you're probably referring to this, but I saw this thing where they're just have AI influencers, right? And it's usually like an attractive girl or man, and it's like doing what attractive influencers do and like selling products, right? Because that's how they make their money, right? But it's just so wild because it's like the only reason people liked influencers on Instagram was because you had a little bit of like a push and pull of like, oh, it's a real person, it's not an ad. I actually kind of think this person's cool. I like their content, they're real. And oh yeah, and then they sell me like, smoothies or whatever. But it's like you can't just do that with AI because you're going to completely give up the entire that entire balance that you just had. You're just making another ad, right? Like, do they think that we're that dumb? Do they think that we won't catch on? But that's the theory of the gray web. The theory of the gray web is that it doesn't ever matter that anyone catches on. It doesn't even matter that anyone's there. It's all just, I don't know, just an abandoned mall, right? I think that's where we're going. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I think my positive spin on it is I think we're going to see a return to books saying no AI was used in the process, and I think if you're fine with AI being used in the process, that's okay. Like artists can use AI in certain things, but I do think there's going to be a level of people really asking that question of things they're consuming, because they're going to have to change their patterns of consumption if they don't know if it's AI or not.
I was about to say USDA certified organic, but then I realized like, oh, USDA probably won't
Yeah,
exist by
exactly.
then
Yeah.
either. Yeah, I mean, I think that will be important. And actually tying it back to something earlier, one great infrastructure for that would actually be
Yeah, yeah,
NFTs.
yeah. Blockchain. Yeah, right.
You
I
know,
mean,
like not something for sale, just something certifying.
no, exactly. I think that's the thing. I mean, that's like I said, going back to the first NFT and Monograph and Kevin McCoy, which I talk about in the book. I mean, that was the idea. It was completely well intentioned, and then we've already covered kind of where that went. But yeah, I think potentially that does come back. I think that's an interesting thought. I fully buy into that. It could be used for that. But my critical hat says, well, those are kind of the same two groups, right? The blockchain and the AI people, they're sort of on the
Mm,
same side of this equation, right? So I'm just looking for that very small Venn diagram of people who are thinking about this problem, like we were discussing, and are in blockchain. I do find that those are kind of in bed together right now, right? It's like this constant digital utopianism. This constant idea that like we'll fix something by releasing something new. I just worry if that's really going to come to fruition.
mm. Well, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I'm hoping that the lefty dissident crypto in the old sense of the word, like just focusing on the cryptography freaks, come out of the woodwork and step up in a big way for stuff like that. Not again to feed into techno
Yeah.
solutionism and techno fixes, but to sort of participate in a different way of
Mhm.
relating. You had mentioned encountering transformative adaptation and
Mhm.
Throughtopia and seeing a rhyme with your techno progressivist
Mhm.
position. So what sparked for you there?
Yeah, that was a fascinating conversation, and I've been privy to those philosophical debates, but I had not encountered Reed until your podcast. And the Throughtopia concept to me really hinge on a few things. One is this idea that dystopia is a losing strategy, which I kind of or dystopian thinking or dystopian propaganda, despite its unfortunate reality in some cases in the climate debate. That's not a path we can use, and also we can't. Which sort of as Reed says, it's too late for utopias in another sense. So that rhymed a lot with the tension that I was trying to pull out in my book. The concept of Throughtopia is just sort of a better way, I think, or a different way of saying what I'm trying to say with techno progressivism, right? Like we cannot dystopianly give up. We cannot give up hope. We have to go towards a utopia, but we can't be utopian in our thinking about it, right? Like we have to paint a picture of where we're going and why. I think a Throughtopia is essentially managing and adapting the way we build with that utopian mind without being and many times climate change utopians I'm sure have digital utopianism. They think that more tech is going to fix it, or I've heard various things like AI will figure it out, or we just need this new tool. We just need a little bit more capitalism to get there, right? So yeah, I love that concept. I think that is a fruitful way to think about the way it's being used in climate change, I think it's also a fruitful way to port onto essentially the problem of the future of techno utopianism and platform capitalism.
I so appreciate that. Like, it gets to me at the heart of the issue around tech. Like when people talk about tech, and you so deftly show how tech embodies so
Mm-hmm.
many ideologies and political positions, and sort of in a hilarious way, you reference how in the Techno Optimist Manifesto, Mark Andreessen kind of situates technology within the lineage of the Greek techne, which is something I agree with, but he takes it in a
Yeah.
direction that I disagree with. But like the idea that human evolution is paired with with tool
Mm-hmm.
making, and we can call that technology under a broad view, but tech now means something
Mm-hmm.
different. And so navigating what it means to retain our curiosity, retain our imagination, retain our narrative capabilities, apply those toward real world problems by addressing those root causes. Like we have to, like, there's no way we're gonna survive this century, let alone like, flourish in the future if we don't do that. But so much of tech has kind of colonized those ideas with these particular kind of like capitalist
Mm-hmm.
market ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, like just I guess big kudos to you
Yeah, and
for
the other thing I
yeah.
love about it is how he mentions one of the sort of tasks is that artists, writers, philosophers use this thinking and essentially create this idea of a utopia, right? I mean, that goes back to your question about like what is the role of criticism, and I think that squares with that as well, right? I mean, I think that we do live in the binary of dystopia and utopia, and that's because of literature, that's because of art, right? Um, so yeah, there's this like again applying to a totally different problem, but there's this value in utopian art and utopian imaginaries that I find again is just like extremely useful.
Totally. Well, we've done you've been incredibly insightful as expected. Is there anything from Against Platforms that we didn't touch on that you feel like, oh, it'd be great to loop that into this discussion?
No, I mean we really covered like all the bases and more. So this is a great conversation. I sometimes think about that at the end of conversations, but not in this one. I think, and especially that I'm glad we talked about utopias a little bit.
Yeah, me too. Okay, great. I'm very, very glad to hear that. As I've mentioned, I like to close every episode with 3 recurring questions. You've inevitably answered some of those questions already. Feel free to bring that information in, or bring us in a totally new direction. What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Yeah, how our technology is made. Again, dovetailing right on your piece in the book. It's actually called technology isn't given, it's made. So I think if we pay attention to how present digital technology works and we compare that to the narrative that's being spun, I think that's incredibly important. AI is the obvious example. It's not thinking, it's not magic, it's math. So yeah, we should pay attention to that.
Very beautiful and complex math, but math
Yeah.
all the same. Um, what is one resource you recommend for making better sense of reality?
So this one, I'm going to give it an abstract answer, but it's going outside, talking to people, being in communities, being in groups. I think that the pandemic showed us a dark side of when we close in and when we're individualist and when we're online and when we shut ourselves off from various people. I know everyone, some people had families they could lean on, but we really did lose that sense of the public sphere, and we lost that sense of what we're doing this for. So my resource is your own community and thinking about thinking being more thoughtful about how you're interacting with that community, and how that community can actually enrich you.
Mm. Yeah, it really feels like we're still seeing the ripple effects of the kind of brain breaking aspects of those isolation periods. Which is not to say I'm not making a political critique. Just echoing your
Mhm.
point. What is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Well, yeah, I mean, to go back to the pandemic, I mean, I feel like you're going to have a lot of people say this for the next several years. Um, I gotta say, it was the time during lockdowns in the pandemic. Um, I guess we had, you know, in the historical span of time, we'd potentially lived a pretty privileged life, right? On various registers, and not all of us, of course, but I mean, the way that we saw society just completely be fractured in the matter of a few months and few weeks, just really disrupted my sense of meaning. And like, as we've covered, like I'm kind of a history buff. I think about existing in time, and it really just like felt like history was happening to me. And I kind of had a lot of empathy for like all of the history I've studied, all of the sort of, the time when a sort of calamitous change happens. Having it happen in real time just disrupted my sense of reality and my sense of my place in the world, or our place in the world.
Mm. Yeah, when you brush with the cool zone,
Yeah.
it stops being the cool zone. Amazing. Well, I'm so glad we got to do this. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you? You mentioned you have a Substack.
Yeah. So the book is, I'm very fortunate. It's pretty much out there via distributor. So what that means is like most major bookstores will have it. It's on all of the online bookstores. So I'm very grateful for that. You can choose your favorite one. And I believe it's pretty well covered like in IRL bookstores, which, it would be great if folks could find it there. And then where I am online, I am still on Twitter. I don't love it as much as I used to. I don't post as much as I used to. Probably heard that before. But yeah, I've also started a Substack where, despite my reservations about what Substack does and it's the fact that it is a platform, I'm finding it useful to help me work out some of the ideas in post the book. So very much akin to the kind of discussions we're having of like what comes next. And that Substack is just, Mike Pepi.
Amazing. Well, Mike, thank you again for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the incredible conversation.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.